Okay, this morning we're studying from the book of 1 Samuel. Which, really, is the book about Samuel? A little bit, yeah? Is the book about David at this point? Kind of, yeah. One of the questions that is asked in the book is, how is David like Christ? And that is really what this is about. When we look at the Old Testament, everything in the Old Testament points to the coming of the Christ. It is all within that context, and that's why David is important. And how it is he reflects the life of Christ. He's the foreshadowing of Jesus and all of that. So just by way of quick review, oh, and by the way, today we're going to be reading about David, and he does some really strange things. He goes to the enemy. He's already done that once already. He goes to this enemy, and he acts like a crazy man. He dribbles on his chin, and writes on the wall, and he just gibbers and stuff, and he acts all crazy. So he's already done some weird things to preserve his life, and we find him in a very awful situation in his life where he's having to live his life a specific way, that people are having to lie for him and do all these things, and he has to do all lies and deceiving people so that he can stay alive. But just real quick, in this book, chapters 1 through 8, it's basically we see Samuel come into to replace Eli and his sons. He is the successor, a prophet. Then chapters 9 through 15, the people ask for the king. We see Saul come in through being anointed by God. He proves himself. He disobeys God. Then he is rejected by God. And then the rest of this book, and we are right at the end of this part, where we see the rise of David and Saul's decline. He starts by killing Goliath in that verse in chapter 16. Saul takes notice of him in that moment and is obviously convinced, because God has taken away the kingdom from him, that David is going to be the next king. And then we just see all of these things happen. I'm not going to go through everything, but basically it's a Saul chasing David thing, and David fleeing from Saul. But during all of these things, we see David and Jonathan, this beautiful relationship. And Jonathan, of course, is the son of Saul. So there's a gigantic conflict. This is like a big daytime soap opera melodrama thing, with this the intrigue of a kingdom and the king himself being thrown in there in the mix. And I would imagine that a lot of stories are taken from this. One of the big pivotal points is in chapters 21 and 22. We see this starts this period of alliances. Everybody knows David's going to be king. So David starts to amass an army, or but people have been attaching themselves to him. But we see Saul do this horrible thing with Ahimelech. When they find out that Ahimelech helped David, Ahimelech and his family and the city is murdered. All of the priests are murdered. So at that point, we see that Saul has basically thrown his life away completely. Sinning is one thing, but once you do that, the dividing line is drawn. David gets the sword of Goliath, and now David's traveling around with these 600 guys. And what kind of guys are they? Are they really nice guys? No, they're not really nice guys at all. They're disassociated from people. They're in deep debt, so they are kind of anti-government. So they're kind of traveling around with these guys. They're called useless and worthless in some versions of the Bible. So he's got all these people, and he's traveling around. In chapter 25, we see that Samuel dies. And that's important to remember as well, because now there's no central prophet by which we see Israel who can go, who are you going to go to? Who are you going to talk to? So this is now the struggle between kings and who would be king. David is marrying wives. So, this isn't like happening in one day. It reads like it happens within a week, but it takes years to take place. David has married Michal. She's removed from him as being his wife. I feel horrible for Michal. She loves David when she marries him. And then we see later that there's a little bit of division between her and David. She disrespects him in some ways. And I can't help but think that maybe she doesn't really like the fact that he's going to be not that he's going to be king, but that he's getting all these wives. She might be all right with it. I mean, it was normal, I suppose, for those days. All these things are happening, and Saul is just going crazy. He's doing all these crazy things. 2 times we just read Saul loses face in front of his 3,000 warriors, where David could have taken his life, but he doesn't. So I think the writing's on the wall for everybody, but Saul is still the king. And this chapter 27 is the beginning of the end of Saul. We're going to see Saul die in a couple of chapters. And so it's going to be his ending, and then we'll see David take his place in 2 Samuel. But for now, David is still on the run, and he has to do some crazy, kooky things. And one of the questions is, is this a low point in David's life? And of course it is. And we can see that. Like I mentioned earlier, Michal risks her own life by lying to her father, the king, about David's whereabouts and all that. And this is kind of what everybody's having to do in order to spare David's life. So before we get into chapters 27, let's have a word of prayer. Our holy God and Father, we're so thankful, Lord, that we can be here today, that we can gather around your word. For us, it is a great treasure. We ask and pray, Lord, that all the things we do would be in accordance with your will. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, so all of these things are going on. David has 600 people with him, at least 600 men. And I'm not sure with that's a lot of mouths to feed. So I'm not sure exactly everything that he's doing, but if you have 600 people, you're going to have to get resources to feed them. You're going to have to do those kinds of things. So if you're David, who just 12 chapters ago, he was a kid tending sheep, now he's wandering around the countryside with 600 people, and he's a young man. I'm assuming he's still a young man. But he has this sword, which indicates that he's a warrior as well. He has Goliath's sword. Now, I don't know that he uses Goliath's sword, because it's probably not weighted for him, but it is at least a sign for everybody else. And this is going to, I think has some bearing on what we see David do now. So let's read. David said to himself, "Now I will perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape into the land of the Philistines." Okay, David is saying, I'm going to go to the Philistines. Why would you do that? Saul then will despair of searching for me anymore in all the territory of Israel, and I will escape from his hand. So David arose and crossed over, he and the 600 men who were with him, to Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David lived with Achish at Gath, and he and his men, each with his household. So there's a lot more than 600 people. Even David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's widow. By the way, was that okay for him to do that? Yeah, it was okay. And just another note, really quick. Nabal was David's relative, just so we make that clear. He was a relative, and I am assuming that he took Nabal's stuff. I don't think he tried to take his land, but I think he took his stuff with him, just because he could. I don't know that she would inherit it necessarily, but he had all these mouths to feed. And so he's probably doing a lot of things like that because he has to. Now it was told Saul that David had fled to Gath, and he no longer searched for him. So my question is, what is David's reasoning for fleeing to the enemy? Who else is from Gath? And how does this all work? And let's describe that group that's with David. Let's start there first. Somebody tell me what this group would look like. Who's with David?
Indebted.
Yeah, okay, they're all indebted. But what physically, when you're looking at the people, what kind of people are there?
Pretty tough.
Pretty tough. Are there children there?
Yes.
Yeah. There's children there. There's wives there. There's children there. It isn't just 600 men. You know, this isn't Robin Hood and his merry men, although I think that's where this story probably came from. And I think a lot of stories come from the Bible, the sword and the stone, all this stuff. But yeah, we've got these 600 families that are traveling around. And so if you're David, and you're obviously going to feel responsible for them, I think this is what we're seeing affect his reasoning behind things. So what is his reasoning to go to this place, to the Philistines?
It's the last place Saul's going to look for him.
Right? Yeah. Why? Why would that be the last place?
David killed Goliath.
David killed Goliath. Who else was from Gath? Goliath. It makes no sense at all. It sounds so crazy. Yeah, it would be like the last place you would look. Yes, Jeff.
Yeah, it seems to me like since David wasn't going to fight Saul, Saul was after David,
Yeah.
but David wasn't going to fight Saul. David felt more afraid of Saul than he did the Philistines.
He was afraid. He was afraid, and that I don't think that questions his faith. I just think he understands that he has to do something in order for this to stop. Yes.
Yeah, he could fight the Philistines, but he couldn't fight Saul. He didn't feel like he could fight Saul.
Right. And Saul was forcing that hand at every turn. Saul's forcing that hand where David should be killing Saul if he's going to defend himself in that sense. But at every turn, God has given a way out of that, so David doesn't have to. And it's always this really close call. There was one time when they're circling around this mountain, and they just are just a few hours ahead of them. And then another time, Saul's after him, but the Philistines are attacking us. So you have to stop this pursuit, David.
Well, to me, one big reason that David went to Achish, is that he did that in chapter 21, and it didn't turn out so well, so he left. God made it a bad situation, but this time they shared the same enemy, so that's why Achish accepted him.
Okay.
He and his families, they had the same enemy, and he was going to also, as a side note, I would suspect Achish as a leader saw those 600 fighting men as an asset to him.
Yep.
To fight Saul. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. We'll get to exactly that point, and especially in the next chapter when things get ramped up. Things are going to really, really ramp up for David. I mean, if you're the type of person that worries, and I don't know if David was that person, but it just gets worse from here. So let's read verses 5 through 7. Then David said to Achish, "If now I have found favor in your sight, let them give me a place in one of the cities in the country, that I may live there. For why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. The number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. That's a long time. So my other thinking about what was going on with why they were able to accept David was because of his might. He shows up with an army. He shows up with the sword of Goliath. He shows up with all these things, and going against it would have been difficult, I think, for anybody. It would have probably been a thing where they're thinking, God is with this guy. We know the God of Israel is with David. Should I go up against him? Maybe if I get another king, I could. It would be all this planning and things. So I think David probably brought some moxie with him, if you will. He kind of scared people a little bit because everybody knew God was with him. So, what is David's attitude towards Achish? Is he humble? Is he shrewd? Or is he both?
Both.
He's both. He's very humble. I think this is one of the characteristics of David that we see that is very much like Christ. He sees the value of being humble towards others and how that can help in a relationship, how that can get you to specific places with people. He's very humble. He's like, hey, Achish, why would he calls himself a servant. Why would you have a servant live in your royal city? Just give me a place to live. So he has this place to live. David.
I have a question, maybe you could comment on your thoughts on it. When David said, there's no better thing for me to do, in other words, I got pretty much no choice here. He chose to go into a land filled with idolatry.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm just, given the relationship between David and God, that would seem to me, it was his last resort.
Yeah.
Was it even, or should it, in your opinion, been a resort? I mean, I know he would have had to fight if he stayed, but I'm perplexed about that.
I'm perplexed about it too. Because when we read about David asking and requiring of God, it says, David inquires of God. It doesn't say that here. And we don't know if this is David's own reasoning, if he inquired of God, or if he just was, like Jeff was saying, he just didn't want to have to get into that altercation with Saul, which Saul was pressing. And it would have happened. If he would have stayed in Israel, eventually it would have happened in his own mind. That's his thinking. And I agree. He goes to a land where there's all kinds of immoral idolatry going on. But it doesn't mean that he would commit, idolatry. And I doubt that he did. And I think everybody let him have the God of Israel because they respected him for that. He brought the proof of having that sword. That was a very symbolic thing to have. Even if he didn't use it, the symbolism behind, I have the God with me. He brought that to them. And I don't know that he tried to convert anybody. I doubt it. But yes, Adam and then Jeff.
It's really such a complicated situation.
Yes.
Right? And when you look at it from the big picture, providentially, God's got this plan, right? And we're not necessarily told all the details of God's plan, but David was already anointed to be king of Israel, yet he was not yet reigning as king in Israel, right? Saul was still the king. And because of that, and because of David's respect for God, David continued to honor Saul as the king as God's anointed king in Israel, right? And so you've got that preventing David from taking action. And then you see this little weird series of lies that David's going to tell to Achish about all of the battles that he was doing, right? Claiming he was against Israel when he really wasn't. He was doing all these other things. And so you've got, on one hand, you've got David's being shrewd and or dishonest. But yet David is still like in this position of power, right?
Right.
Kind of playing
Absolutely.
kind of playing both sides, and
Right.
it's just it's a really intriguing and head scratching situation.
I think it's amazing
Yeah.
to think the whole move going there is such a shrewd move, and it works. Saul stops following him. So that part of the plan absolutely worked, and he must have had faith in himself to remain God's guy, if you will, without Jeff.
Yeah, David, could serve God wherever he was at.
Yep.
People who follow God, it's like, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whenever they was taken off into captivity, they still worshiped and served God. So going into a heathen nation, wouldn't change that. He would be more vexed by the things that were around him, like Lot was when he went to Sodom and Gomorrah. He was vexed daily with the soul because of the things that was around him. But it doesn't mean you have to, give up or change your ways.
Does that happen
Serve
today?
God.
Does that happen today? Are Christians vexed by what they see in the world today?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. We see sin in the world. We are in it, but we're not of it, right? Somebody said that. Yes.
I tend to lean towards what Jeff just said. I think, first off, Saul could never have made David go into join the Philistines, but David did. And I think he was driven by despair, it's whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And that rules us sometimes in our actions. Maybe we don't make the wisest ones when we do that. And fear can cause that. David is not exempt from the anguish and the fear and the despair. Not. Even though he was loved by God, he still was susceptible to it. It's something to ponder when we do things and we do our actions for God. We can't let that cause us to make those decisions. That can't be the decision-making paradigm here. It's got to be what God wants us to do. David knew what God wanted him to do, yet he succumbed to it. That's how I see. Now, all the other stuff happened, yes,
Mhm.
but I think that's the driving force.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, this is a really weird time for David. It's eye-opening because David has become, like I said earlier, who was once this kind of I don't want to say naive, but very young man of a shepherd man. I don't want to say shepherd boy because Danny was really adamant, and I think rightfully so, saying that the little boy images that we see of David when he kills Goliath is not the case. He was at least very close to being fighting age.
Well, he was able to actually put on Saul's armor.
Right. Yeah. If he was a little boy, he would have. Where is he? He would have got lost in there. Okay. So verses 8 and 9. Why is David doing this? What we're going to read about. And then I'm going to go ahead and read through verse 12. And the question in the book was, why is this the low point for David? Now, my question is this the low point for David? And if so, why? So David's doing these things that Adam was talking about, where it's just really crazy. So let's just read 8 through 12. Now David and his men went up. So they went south, but they went up. So maybe because there was a rise in elevation, not because they went up on a map. went up and raided the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites, for they were the inhabitants of the land from the ancient times, as you come to Shur, even as far as the land of Egypt. Now there's Egypt, and then right outside of Egypt is the desert of Shur. It's about 200 miles away from where they were. Now 200 miles in those days was a long way. David attacked the land and did not leave a man or a woman alive. And he took away the sheep, the cattle, the donkeys, the camels, and the clothing. Then he returned and came to Achish. So he's getting resources. Okay, this is what kings do during those days. Now, Achish said, he's not a king, but he's acting like he's going to be king. Now, Achish said, where have you made a raid today? Because that's what kings did in those days, especially the Philistines. And David said, against the Negev of Judah, and against the Negev of Jerahmeelites, and against the Negev of the Kenites, all either of Judah or alliances with Judah. David did not leave a man or a woman alive to bring to Gath, saying, otherwise they will tell about us, saying, so has David done, and so has David been his practice all the time he has lived in the country of the Philistines. So Achish believed David, saying, he surely made himself odious among his people Israel, therefore he will become my servant forever. So why does David do these raids? And he goes far away to do it. And why is he doing this? What's he trying to do? Anybody?
He's getting resources.
He's getting resources, absolutely.
And these are people that were supposed to have been wiped out.
Okay, good point. These are people that God had already made judgment against. Okay, so this wasn't like some kind of unjust thing that David just went in there and just started killing people. Yes.
Could it be that he was trying to get greater favor with Achish because later he pretty much lied to him and said that he was killing all the Israelite groups, whatever.
Yep.
And he was, oh, now I've got him my servant forever.
Yeah.
So that kind of like makes me think that he was trying to gain favor. I could be wrong, but I'm just saying.
Right. This is going to lead right into this next story, next part of the story, I should say. Yeah, he's getting resources. He's taking care of that part of the 600 families he's taking care of. And I mean, they may not all have families, but if they had a family, that came with them. So he's taking care of what he needs to take care of, like any king would. And this is that shrewd part of David again. He lies about it to Achish to gain favor from Achish. How did Achish know that David went on a raid? You're Achish. How do you know it?
All of his warriors were away for a while.
They were away for a while, and then what?
Brought back stuff.
They brought back a bunch of stuff. You see them coming over your people report, oh, they're coming over these hills and they've got loads of things with them. They've got, their camel. They've got more camels than when they left, and they've got goats and stuff. So this was obviously reported to Achish, and he's going, oh, so you went on a raid, huh? Where'd you go? Yeah.
In fact, if I may add something else, this isn't just raiding. He murdered and stripped them of all their stuff. He didn't leave anyone alive. He was robbing people. This is not, if you were to talk about David, that's not the picture that comes up in my mind. But that's what he was doing. It was just it's the furthest distance from God, a godly man, than almost, I don't know, but it seems
Okay.
like it's really far from
Kay says these were people who God had passed judgment against them.
Okay, but he knew better than to murder people. He could have taken them captive, whatever, right? But he actually
Okay, I would have to look into that But because God did call for genocide on some of the peoples that he judged against. Ken? Or Jeff?
Especially the Amalekites.
Yes.
Saul sinned by not getting rid of.
Right, by not wiping out the Amalekites. Jeff?
You know, the Israelites, when they first came into the land, were told not to spare anybody, you know. so
Yeah,
they
well, there
were
were
to come
7
in-
nations that they were not to
Yeah, they were
spare.
to come in, and the land that was given to them, they were to come in and annihilate the population. And they made leagues with the Gibeonites, I believe it was, and stuff, and they, because they didn't totally wipe out everybody like they were told to, they had problems with them, like
Right.
the Philistines and stuff like that, you know. Well, David went to fight against these people that were still in the land, because David didn't say, well, I went to fight against Israel and stuff. He said, I went to the southern part, you know, so it must have been these other people were still in the land of the Israelites. And he just got rid of them.
Okay, so I think there's a little bit of question there still for me, in my mind still. I'd have to look into what Kay is saying about that. But that's a good point. You know, David does all this. This shows what he's trying to build on his own. I think it is interesting. It specifically leaves out that he inquires God about any of this. It doesn't say that he asks God about it. It just says he does it. I'm not saying he didn't inquire. It just doesn't tell us that he did. So this is all a very interesting thing. There's too much speculation that could go on. Is this a low point for David? Anybody? Because that was the question in the book. Is this part of his life? Is it a low point in his life? Yes? No? All of the things that are happening with Saul, the thing with Jonathan, and you know, they had to part ways. His wife, Michael, is off somewhere. She's been given to somebody else. He's having to lie. Everybody's having to lie for him. Is this a low point? What do you think?
I would say no. David doesn't experience punishment or repercussions for his actions until he sins with Bathsheba and Uriah. And then that's when his life falls apart. I think that's the low point, not this.
Okay. David?
What I was gonna say is I I don't want people to think I'm saying the wrong thing here. I know that God wanted him to eliminate those folks.
Yeah.
But that's not why he did it. So there's a
Okay.
huge difference
All
from
right.
intent. He went there, he robbed them, and he killed them
Yeah.
to prove a Leviticus or whatever you want to say. But he did it like a robber and a killer, not as God said. He did. We don't have, like you said, we don't have any indication that he had guidance from God.
Okay.
I'm just saying, intense.
I agree. I agree with everybody. I would just say, why was David refused the ability? Why did God tell David, you don't get to build a temple?
Bloodshed.
Because he shed blood. So I don't know if this is the incident, or it's just because David was a warrior and God didn't want a warrior, and so it wouldn't look good having a temple built by a warrior. So he has Solomon build it. I don't know, but that was part of the reason why he couldn't build the temple, and that's what God told him. You know, you've shed blood. You can't do that. So I think all of these things point to David just doing what he has to do to stay alive. He becomes very shrewd. He becomes what is seemingly unlike that humble kid that we saw earlier, but he is still very humble. He just knows he understands how to use it. He understands the power of that. Okay, and to what Steve is saying, yeah, when I look at it, I think, man, if I was going through that, what a low point that would be. And then but we have to kind of remember who David is, the kind of faith that it took to go in front of a giant guy with a sling and a few rocks, right? David has great faith, and I think that is probably the overriding message for Christians as well, You know, we can have a lot of things going on in our life. A lot of things can be happening. Robin was just advising me about this recently. There's a lot of things that happen in the world that seemingly are terrible. There are a lot of things that happen in our life that are terrible, but we belong to God. When you have that in front of you, like I think David did, he had that thought in his brain. I belong to God. He's going to take care of me. You know, things might happen, but God's going to take care of me. Anybody else? Okay?
Well, I think because he had to leave, he felt he had to leave Israel.
Yes.
And he was the anointed king.
He was anointed.
And he still had to leave his homeland and go in with these heathens and do all kinds of things that he maybe wouldn't have done otherwise.
Right.
So this would have been kind of a low point.
It would have been a low point in that sense. I think I like to think, though, that he always kept his focus on God, even though he's doing all these weird things. And but we're going to see, this is the beginning of the end of Saul. This was actually good timing for David, if he were going to do something like this. We get into chapter 28. We've got a few minutes. And this is the part so David goes to the enemy. He embeds himself to a king, Achish. And Achish just likes David. He likes David. He likes him. Hey, did you go do some raids? Yeah, we were fighting Israel. Oh, great. You're gonna be for me. You're gonna be my guy. So just real quick, verses 1 and 2, and we're not going to get too far with this, and Danny will finish up next week. It came about in those days, okay? So David's in the middle of enemy territory, that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. This is something they did seasonally. Achish said to David, "Know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men." I mean, why not? David said to Achish, "Very well. You shall know that what your servant can do." So Achish said to David, "Very well. I will make you my bodyguard for life." So David, he must have been such a gregarious, likable guy. I don't know what else to think about this fellow. What's David's situation now, and should he be worried, is my question. I guess the question is, would you be worried if you were David? What's the situation, Kay?
Well, he's going to have to fight against his own country.
He's going to have to go. He's going to have to fight his own brothers. Now, has he fought any of his own brothers yet? No, he does not do that. He's going to be king, so he doesn't want to, you don't want to go against your own brothers. So he never has done that. He's made people think he has. And he's embedded himself with this king. The king loves the guy so much. He says, "Look, we're going to go to war, and you're going to come with us. Yeah, I know it's your people, but I know you hate them, so you can come, and you can be my bodyguard for life." Yes, Kay?
Well, do you think Achish is very naive or just puffed up by having David on his side?
That's a good question. Do you think Achish is puffed up having? I mean, David is a Philistine slayer, right? He's got the king. He's got the sword of Goliath. Everybody knows who David is. Adam.
I kind of think that you're going to see this later on with the Ark of the Covenant, right? When they lost the Ark of the Covenant, the Philistines had it,
Yeah.
right? That was like, oh, look at this big, awesome trophy we have. We're going
Right.
to put it in our temple and do all these things. And I think culturally speaking, the mindset of these people at the time word to, hey, look at the awesome thing that I have acquired from our enemies, who's no longer our enemy, but he's a tool of ours, right? Just like the Ark of the Covenant was going to be their tool, right? And I don't know. The more I read this, and the more I think that David is just playing both sides the whole time, and he's never losing his focus on God.
Right.
Real quickly here after this, he strengthens himself in the Lord, and he seeks God's advice when Miklag was attacked and or Ziklag or whatever the city was.
Yeah, Ziklag. Yeah.
I don't know. I think that David, he's got his highs and lows. He's obviously got some emotional depressions from time to time. I just don't see this as one of them.
I agree. And I'm glad you brought up the emotional part about David, because we don't talk to that point very much, but God appreciated that. David was a songwriter, and he wrote love songs about God and how much he loves God. God appreciates that, and God appreciates that so much, he has us get up and sing and express ourselves to him and teach one another through song to one another. It's very important to have that perspective. Does somebody else have their hand up? Okay, so David's in a he's in a pickle. I would consider myself being in a pickle if I was able to deceive somebody so much that and now I'm going to have to be his bodyguard. And what's going to happen when it comes down to me being in battle with my own people? So I'm making the assumption that David is maybe thinking about it, but when we see the character of David, he's trusting in God. I'm assuming he's still trusting in God, that everything is going to work out. Verse 3, now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, his own city, and Saul had moved from the land those who were mediums and spiritists. Okay, so the mediums and the spiritists, I'm assuming, are not your typical prophets. And we'll get into this, and Daniel will have to finish this. So the Philistines gathered together and came and encamped in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa. When Saul, and this is the condition where Saul is, he's descended into this. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And Saul inquired of the Lord. The Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim, or by prophets. So there's the prophets part of this. Then Saul said to his servants, seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. Now, I don't know if he's speaking of somebody specifically, or if they're just anyone that's a woman and is a medium. I don't know. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor. Love that name, that city name, Endor. It sounds like Lord of the Rings or something. I'm telling you, people steal from the Bible all the time for their stories. Anyway.
It's where the Ewoks live.
That's where the Ewoks live, is Endor. Okay, thank you. Oh, okay, that's Star Wars. Okay. See what I'm saying? There's only one big story, and it's in the Bible. That's the best story of all. So, what is Saul's condition and attitude here? And Daniel will get into more of this. Is he kingly? And how has he changed from his beginnings? Anybody? David?
Well, two things. One is really afraid.
Yeah.
Is two, he's trying to seek God in mediums, and God did not answer. So I'll leave you with that.
Yeah, I think the afraid part is what struck me when I read it. We see, Saul at one time being this great warrior and, taking casualties and plunder and that sort of thing. And then when he realizes that God is gone and not supporting him, he becomes afraid. It's like every time he sees the Philistines, he just becomes this guy who's afraid. He's not that guy from the beginning part, right? The guy who proved himself and was with the prophets and speaking and did all the things that he was told to do and showed himself to be among the prophets. And that was actually the saying in the day, is Saul among the prophets now? And he's not that guy anymore. He's just descended into this former shell of who he was. What about this? That was one of my questions. Was it okay for him to ask to go to this medium? Was it okay? Because God wasn't talking to him. Or,
They weren't supposed to have any in the country.
okay. Okay, yeah. You know, when you start getting into the study of what seers are, I mean, you remember Balaam, right? Balaam was kind of like one of these guys who could see things and prophesy things. But was he a diviner? Was he a prophet? Or what? What was he? And what was this lady he's going to see? We see, and I just wanted to bring this up real quick. In 2 Kings, God chides them for going to these kinds of things. In Leviticus, it says no fortune tellers are to be in your land. In Leviticus, it says to put them to death. So I don't think this is actually like in the case of Balaam, where God is talking to Balaam, even though he's not necessarily just God's prophet. I think in this instance, God's not speaking to Saul, so Saul is like, okay, then I'm just going to go somewhere else, and goes against whatever.
One thing to not forget, this is profound throughout Samuel. Saul picked and chose when he was going to listen to God, approach God, and do what God said. There's no denying that.
Right.
And so what's interesting, he rejected God so many times. Then he turns around when he needs him and says, hey, can you help me out? Through
Yeah.
I think that they're condemned mediums and sorcerers and all
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And so that, I mean, his head was not even close to being in the right spot here. So we can't, the takeaway from that is, well, the world of witches and mediums, but you can't pick and choose when you're, I'm going to do it today, I'm going to follow what God said today, but tomorrow, that's a nudge. You know, that's the thing, to me, is the
Yeah.
takeaway from
Yeah,
Saul.
we see that till the end. He does that, and he even talks about God after this. Okay, thank you, and Danny will finish this up. We'll 28 when he gets back.